gathering. Why is whiteness the elephant in the room?
I'll take a stab at it. Well, the elephant in the room is always that which is unspoken of, that which is a present reality, but that we don't refer to openly, usually because we don't have the courage to do so. And as I'm thinking about it today, who knows what I'll think tonight or tomorrow, whiteness for white folk, in my experience, there's the old cliche, the definition of being white is not having to think about it. Because white is framed culturally in this country as normative. And so if you're white, you don't even have to think about white because you're the norm, and anybody else who is non-white is the exception to the norm. And they're the ones who have to self-define and all that. White folks don't have to self-define. We are the norm. So the system is set up for us. But in order to inculcate that mindset in white minds, and it does, it starts in childhood, we have to go through a process in one form or another of suppressing a part of ourselves as white folk. That is to say, that part that knows ourselves as one part of a family of humanity and all people as equal, which is, I think, the inherent innate knowing or knowledge that is born into us, and that this schemes of differentness have to be taught to us by reprimands from our elders, or reprimands from the larger culture, or examples through the larger culture. We talk about the marketing and how historically it's always shown, the white folks as the successful, happy people, and how newspapers still portray, criminal offenders more often than not as people of color, even though in actuality perpetrators of crime are inordinate or proportionally more white folks. So a lot of these subliminal and not so subliminal messages form the understandings in our minds from an early age, and that and so in adulthood, in order to maintain the cultural norm within ourselves, we have to continue to suppress that deeper knowledge of sameness, and that, we're all same beneath the skin, because there's these two forces fighting within us. And that as a white person, to think of oneself as at one with the rest of humanity is somehow layered with shame by the culture. And so there's that, what Reverend Tandayaka, who wrote the book Learning to be White, calls the white shame, not white guilt, which is different. White guilt means, oh damn, we've done a lot of bad things for the last several hundred years. White shame is all about something inherent within me is unfixable and wrong, and that thing that cannot be fixed and is that urge towards connectedness, which is, I think, inherent in our nature, the urge toward connectedness, and we have to suppress that. And also, that because we're taught that the rewards come when you stand out, or that when you conform to the norm. Anyway, that's my thinking on it right now. Somebody else want to take a stab?
I think we don't talk about the elephant in the room, and it gets back to what you were saying about the whiteness being the norm. I sort of conceptualize it as being white, or whiteness is the default. And in order to change the program. You've got to go in and figure out how to, manipulate the text and make it say, you got to really work to make it say something else. Or if you don't want to work at it, then you can just assimilate and be like what the default is supposed to be, because for a lot of folks, that's just easier. I think we just don't know how to talk about what it means to be white. I mean, how often have we asked that question of ourselves? Or what it means to be black? Or what it means to be biracial? Or what it means to be any of the ways in which we identify ourselves? How often have we truly articulated that? And if we don't do that as adults, then kids aren't going to do it. Oftentimes, adults are so afraid to do it that we send all kinds of messages to kids to say, don't talk about that. Beverly Daniel Tatum has a great book called Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria? And at a very early age, and I've seen this, walking through the grocery store, especially when I used to have dreadlocks back when I was much younger. And a kid would point at me and say, "Mama, what's wrong with her hair?" And then the mother would, yank on the kid's arm and say, "Shh, we don't say that." Or, "Mama, why does that man have dirty skin?" "Shh, we don't talk about that. That's rude." And so when you do that enough with any child, it becomes taboo to talk about anything connected to skin color. And then when you start to tie that to the way things are institutionally, culturally, around what it means to be white, the whole notion of privilege and examining that aspect of it, from a black person's perspective, then it becomes, well, I know what it means to be white. It means that you have all that stuff and I have nothing. You have all that access to stuff and I have nothing. But we don't talk about it because it's just assumed that that's how everybody feels. And the only way I see getting around that elephant is just being brave enough to step out of your circle of comfort and having that courageous conversation and naming it. Yeah, there it is right there. I'm not pointing at you, darling. But it's right there. So let's talk about it. But in order for us to get there, we've got to have this skill set, and we've got to give ourselves permission to say it's okay to talk about that. That the world is not going to crumble, that people are not going to have this Jerry Springer moment and start diving across tables and trying to beat the crap out of each other. We just have to say, okay, let's talk about it.
I was just thinking while folks were talking about the idea of whiteness, and in my mind, I'm not sure if whites themselves see whiteness as an elephant in the room, because I don't think whites really think about their race very often, and because there aren't that many situations where whites need to encounter their own race, and there are not many situations where whites are the numerical minority. So at least, and I'm kind of basing this on just talking with students in classes as well, is that I don't get the sense that my students are, the white students are thinking about being white, or in a racial conversation perceive whiteness as an elephant in the room. And now it seems so obvious to me, but just a couple years ago when I was teaching a class on race and ethnicity, I was asking them to talk about, can you define whiteness? What do you associate with whites? Expecting to kind of get answers that there was no real cultural identity to whites. And I was seeing it from a white perspective because I don't really associate a cultural identity with it. But the class was very, not very diverse. So it was white students and maybe 5 African American students who generally sat together. And it became quite clear that those African American students in the class had a definite idea about what whiteness was. And so I don't know if I'm articulating that well, but from my vantage point of being white, it was like, oh, yes, white does have a content if you're not white, especially, if that makes sense.
Yeah, when we did the Get Downtown event in September, and we posed this question to community members, and they had an opportunity to speak on video camera, which many of them did not want to do, which I understand. But many white people were just surprised to be asked that question because many of them had never been asked, and it seemed very foreign to them to even think about what does it mean to be white in America? And that was a question we asked. And in doing research, it was just baffling that, it is a very different question to ask a white person, what does it mean to be white? But we found, I think, in asking that question, many people of color knew exactly and could tell you stories or list off things what they thought it meant to be white. And so it was just interesting that you brought that up because I kind of had that same experience when we were doing the Get Downtown event, that many people of color were very clear and could rattle off several things about what it meant to be white. The next question is, what makes this conversation difficult, which I think we touched on a little bit, but why is it important to address this topic? Why should we be having this conversation? What makes it important? Anyone want to?
Well, I think if there's anything that people aren't aware is an issue, then that it's affecting so many people in one group of and not at all in the other. I'm thinking of an exhibit that we did at the Science Museum in Richmond, and it was about race. And there was one quote where they said something like what Paul was talking about, where a person who's white doesn't have to think about their race every day. They hardly have to think about it at all. Where for a person of color, there's not really a day that goes by that there isn't some event or some reminder that brings that to the forefront of your mind. So those are the kinds of things, these implicit assumptions that go underneath of our conversations and keep us from communicating with each other. In the work that I do, we talk about the way that we construct history, for example, and the fact that in America, we often focus on European people's arrival and their movement westward. And that's the beginning of history, when they get here and what they do when they arrive. We're not talking about lots of other people who were already here. We're not talking about other people who came and went in that mix. It's almost as though the story begins in 1607 when John Smith and his other English settlers show up. And that continues all throughout. We privilege the story that we are telling, the narrative that becomes important to us, which is a national story, and we sort of impute this destiny to it, and freedom, and the frontier, and all of these words that we like, and we talk about the new world. Well, it was only new to some of those people. There were lots of people who didn't think it was new at all. And we don't talk about the history of the African people that came here. When I was in grade school, I learned nothing about whole civilizations in Africa and what people had done and the achievements that they had made. And when I grew up, I felt really cheated because that stuff wasn't in our books. People who were tribal were seen as an earlier step on the evolutionary scale. And their histories were put in museums of natural history where we talk about dinosaurs and bugs and rocks, but not in history museums where we talk about human beings. So it's become very, very important to me to think about the words that we use, the way that we frame the story, and whose agenda is being put forward, because there's always an agenda. So that's, kind of my focus on this whole topic.
the phrase that came to my mind when you asked, why do we need to talk about this is we have no problem. Again, that yes, we talk about we've made such progress, et cetera, but it seems periodically that we come up against our blind spots as a society, and it feels like whiteness in this, asking it in this way, is kind of a cultural blind spot for at least, particularly for white folks, as you pointed out, and it's sort of the next step in this whole process, because we're never going to really overcome the divisions, the artificial divisions that separate us in terms of perceptions or constructs, until we have the courage and the wherewithal, the medium through which to address this question.
Anyone else on the difficulty? The questions are beginning to roll in. Keep them coming.
Well, I'll just add something quickly. Difficulty. I've just been thinking that it's important to have the conversation, and it's difficult to have the conversation because if you ask individual white people, however you define that, if they feel privileged or powerful, they're going to say, no, absolutely not. I mean, I've got no power, I've got no privilege here, I'm just struggling to make ends meet just like everybody else. But one neglects to examine the larger power, that as a class, as a collective, whiteness does have power in the culture, and that we, both white and non-white, need to struggle with exactly what that means and how to craft a more egalitarian social environment. As Karen mentioned, there's agency, there's power that's at stake here. And earlier in the panel, someone mentioned, the boxes that we check, and I always kind of crack up because for me, there's sort of Hispanic, and then there's Hispanic non-white. And I'm not sure where I'm supposed to check because I'm in there somewhere, and I just don't know where.
No, I want you to hold it closer.
Okay. Well,
He's in there somewhere, but he doesn't know where. Is that right? Is this working? A question from the audience is why black students get more financial aid at school than whites of the same income. Isn't that discrimination? Is why, and a tangential point is that there is a black entertainment television network, but not a white entertainment television network. So how do we deal with these discrepancies?
On the first question, do your homework. 97% of all scholarships or the monies go towards white students. I mean, there's just no comparison. And I think the response to the second question is, it was the entertainment industry as we know it was initially created by white folks. So that's why, again, it's the assumption was that white was normative in its inception, and so anything according to race is different and therefore other, and it's that otherness that we're trying to. Sorry, not being very articulate about that.
I think this that question is a great example of why it's important to be able to meet people where they're at. Some people are over here with regards to, and this is related to the evolution question I was talking about and my understanding of what it meant to be black. I think people who have an understanding of what it means to be who they are as defined in society and how it relates to how we create those societal norms are in lots of different places. And so when because I've heard those questions a lot in the work that I do. You know, why is there a Miss Black America, or why is there BET, or why are there the Latino Music Awards, or things that look at that seem to be separate. And when we have a society that did not start out inclusive in the first place and continues to struggle with that inclusiveness, the only way that people feel like they are part of the United States, and I would want to just speak specifically to how we operate here in the U.S., then folks are compelled to create those avenues that they can identify with because they haven't been allowed to participate in other ways fully the way white folks have been able to participate. And so when I hear the question, well, why isn't there a white entertainment TV, then the response is, well, that's CBS, that's NBC, that's Fox News, that's, you know, or Fox TV. Those are the stations. When you break down the numbers, you know, like you said, you have to do your homework, but you have to do it in a way that gives people a little slap in the back of the head with, okay, it was a good question, and you have to have a good response for those folks who might be over here relative to their understanding of what culture is all about. Because if we're not, some people, when they ask those kinds of questions, they get their hand slapped, or the response is, you know, well, duh, you know. that can add to the pushing back of why some folks don't come to the table. And so that's a really, I respect the question. I know it may, you know, whether or not it was put out there in a heartfelt way, I respect the question, but there are some people who really have that understanding of the separateness, and they're trying desperately to understand what that means. And I think it's our responsibility to continue to try to educate folks and do it in a way that hopefully doesn't build the walls up even further.
I just want to address that for a second, too, because I think it's important to look at the kinds of fears that underlie some questions like that, and to think, you know, if in fact we were passing policies that were just race-based entitlement, are some groups of people being elevated above other people? And I think if you look at any set of statistics, the answer would be no. But there are folks who, you know, when they get amongst themselves and some of these stereotypes come to the surface, there's a fear there. And the one that is jumping out at me is people saying, you know, all those Mexicans coming to take our jobs. You know, well, there are lots of different ways that we can break that down. But the bottom line is, I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job, and someone that I don't understand is going to take it away from me. So these kinds of dialogues are so critical in allowing us to understand one another and to find out that there really is that human thread at the bottom, that commonality. And this microphone is going off and on. But the idea that there's not these huge blocks of people that are forming brigades in order to disenfranchise white people and to put everybody else at the top of the heap. I mean, that's just not happening. So, I mean, we have to look at a little bit of, you know, what's happening in the world and look at the stats and say, you know, there's no group that's being elevated over white people at this time.
Yeah, just look at the stats in everything. Whether it's Pell Grants, whether it's scholarship money, whether it's welfare recipients, because white people make up a greater portion of the population, they consume a greater portion of all those. So it's easy to research. Google it if you can't find it. But another question is, as a white person, when, if at all, do you notice the difference in your race from other races? Are you cognizant of the differences? And this person says, I very often see the differences in commercials. There will be 4 whites and 1 black instead of 4 blacks and 1 white. So when do you recognize those differences?